Bible is one of the most widely translated and read texts of all time. Its stories, teachings, and religious principles have spanned millennia, leaving a profound impact on cultures and civilizations around the globe. However, with so many translations over the centuries, some important nuances may have been lost or altered. These changes, often imperceptible to contemporary readers, may have significantly influenced how we understand certain biblical passages and concepts. A notable example, which frequently provokes academic discussion, is the word Elohim, which appears regularly in the Old Testament. In the original Hebrew language, Elohim is a plural term, and in its literal translation, could be understood as gods. However, in many Bible translations, this term is presented as God in the singular, which substantially modifies the original meaning of the word. The translation to the singular, which is widely disseminated and accepted, reflects a monotheistic view central to the Judeo-Christian tradition. However, this change raises a series of interpretative and historical questions that cannot be overlooked. If Elohim really refers to a plurality of gods in the original text, what does this reveal about the ancient Hebrews' view of divinity? This question leads us to consider the possibility that the Hebrews, at some point in their history, may have held beliefs similar to those of other ancient civilizations, which worship pantheons of gods. Egyptians, Babylonians, Sumerians, and many other cultures contemporary with the Hebrews practiced polytheism, venerating various deities with specific powers and roles. Did the ancient Hebrews share this pluralistic view, only consolidating into monotheism in later stages of their history? Or does the term Elohim not suggest exactly a multiplicity of gods, but rather an expression of the complexity, majesty, and multiplicity of aspects of God himself, as some theologians argue? Traditional Christian theology argues that the use of the plural term Elohim should not be understood as a reference to a plurality of gods, but as a way to reinforce the greatness and power of God. In this sense, the plurality of the term would be a way of reflecting the majesty and vastness of the Creator without implying an original polytheism. However, this interpretation is not consensual, and many scholars suggest that modern translations, by opting for simplifications, end up suppressing the richness of the meanings that the term originally carried. Another striking example of how translations can influence the understanding of biblical passages is the use of the term ruach. In Hebrew, ruach has a variety of meanings and can be translated as spirit, wind, or breath, depending on the context in which it appears. However, in many Bible translations, the word is often simplified to spirit, which, although appropriate in certain contexts, limits the interpretative possibilities of the passage. The metaphor of wind, or breath, can have profound theological implications, especially concerning creation and God's interaction with the world. When the broader and more complex meanings of the original words are reduced to a single interpretation, the reader loses the depth and richness of the nuances that the original Hebrew and Greek texts conveyed. These questions lead us to reflect on how many other details may have been altered over the numerous translations of the Bible. While many of these changes may have occurred unintentionally, others were likely influenced by specific theological and cultural issues of each period and place. The process of translation, by its very nature, is never neutral. Every linguistic choice carries with it an interpretation. Therefore, many scholars and theologians recommend that translations be accompanied by a careful reading of the original texts so that the modern reader can capture, at least in part, the nuances that the Hebrew or Greek text presented in its original state. This concern also applies to the New Testament, which was originally written in Greek. Just as with the Old Testament, key words used by Jesus and the apostles have gone through various translations, which in turn may have altered how these words are interpreted today. A relevant example is the Greek term agape, which is often translated as love. However, in the context of ancient Greek, agape has a deeper meaning, referring to a type of unconditional, altruistic, and sacrificial love, something that goes far beyond what we typically understand as love in our daily lives. By reducing agape simply to love, many translations end up diluting the true spiritual and ethical depth that this original concept carried. The translation of the Bible is, therefore, an incredibly delicate and highly responsible process. The choice of one word over another can significantly alter our perception of fundamental themes, such as the nature of God, the creation of the universe, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. The rich semantics of the original languages, such as Hebrew and Greek, make it almost impossible to capture all meanings and shades in a single modern language. For this reason, relying on a single translation of the Bible can be risky for those seeking a deep understanding of the sacred texts. Although Bible translations are made with good intentions, it is inevitable that they pass through cultural, linguistic, and historical filters, which influence how the texts are understood. Even the most careful and dedicated translators are not free from the influences of their own time and social context. This brings us to a crucial question. To what extent have the various translations of the Bible generated multiple versions of the sacred text, each with its own nuances and interpretations? And are these versions still faithful to the original message conveyed by the earliest sacred texts? Many Bible scholars, as well as contemporary theologians, dedicate themselves to the study of the original languages to recover, as much as possible, the meanings that may have been lost over the centuries. The study of ancient Hebrew and Greek offers us the opportunity to get closer to the original meanings and linguistic nuances that may have been obscured in modern translations. At the same time, these studies also remind us that the full understanding of a text as ancient and complex as the Bible requires care, discernment, and a constant openness to new discoveries and interpretations. However, the persistent question is, to what extent does what we believe today faithfully represent the original message of the Bible? Has the process of translation and interpretation over the centuries brought us closer to, or further away from, the true essence of biblical teachings? The Bible, as we know, is more than just a religious text. It is also a historical document that has traversed numerous cultures and civilizations, shaping and being shaped by them. With so many versions available, it is up to us, as readers and seekers of truth, to try to retrieve the meaning as close as possible to the original, with the help of tools that allow for a critical and contextualized reading. These considerations are not restricted only to issues of translation, but also to the very narrative content of the Bible, which, as a text composed in different historical periods and by various authors, was inevitably influenced by other myths and stories of antiquity. An interesting example of this interconnection is the comparison between Yahweh, the biblical God, and Enlil, one of the main Sumerian deities. Although at first glance, these two gods may seem completely distinct in terms of character and context, a more detailed analysis reveals intriguing parallels. Enlil, in Sumerian mythology, was the god of the air and ruler of the heavens. He was seen as a powerful and severe deity, responsible for maintaining order in the world. In one particular narrative, Enlil decides to send a great flood to destroy humanity due to its disorderly and chaotic behavior. This story bears notable similarities to the biblical account of Noah's flood, where God, Yahweh, decides to destroy humanity with a flood, saving only Noah, his family, and the animals. In both accounts, the flood emerges as a divine response to corruption and disorder in the world, and in both cases, salvation occurs through a chosen intermediary, who receives divine instructions to build an ark and survive the disaster. These parallels between the stories of Enlil and Yahweh raise hypotheses about the possibility that the biblical authors may have adapted or recontextualized older myths, such as the Sumerian one, to create narratives that suited their own worldview. This, however, does not mean that the biblical stories are mere copies of Sumerian myths, but rather that they are part of a continuous process of cultural exchange and adaptation of ideas. Many ancient cultures shared similar myths, adapting them to reflect their own religious beliefs and worldviews. Another interesting example of a parallel between ancient myths and biblical narratives is the figure of the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who presents similarities with female figures in the Bible, such as Eve. Inanna was a goddess associated with fertility, love, and war, but she was also known for her curiosity and disobedience. In one myth, Inanna descends into the underworld in search of power and knowledge, defying divine rules and orders. This act of disobedience brings consequences for Inanna and the world around her. Similarly, Eve, in the biblical account of the Garden of Eden, is seen as responsible for introducing sin and mortality into human life by eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge. Like Inanna, Eve defies a divine order in search of something more, and this act brings profound repercussions for humanity. These connections do not necessarily mean that the biblical myths derive directly from Sumerian narratives, but they do reflect themes common to ancient cultures. The desire to understand the relationship between the divine and the human, the quest for knowledge and power, and the consequences of that pursuit. These stories, present both in the Bible and in Sumerian myths, are expressions of universal existential questions that ancient cultures sought to understand through their religious narratives. By analyzing these possible connections between Sumerian myths and biblical stories, we begin to see the Bible not only as an isolated religious text, but as part of a rich tapestry of narratives that interact with the traditions of other ancient cultures. Recognizing these influences and parallels helps us better understand the context in which the biblical texts were written, and how they reflect not only an exclusive monotheistic vision, but also a continuous dialogue with the cultural and religious traditions of other civilizations. Another point of emphasis when studying the Bible in comparison to other ancient cultures is the passages that cause discomfort to modern readers. Many of these passages seem to challenge the image of a loving and just creator. A clear example can be found in the book of Deuteronomy, where God instructs the Israelites to completely destroy certain cities, killing men, women, children, and even animals. This type of narrative raises deep questions about the nature of God and how these passages should be interpreted in light of modern conceptions of morality and justice. For many contemporary readers, it is difficult to reconcile these descriptions of violence commanded by God with the image of a compassionate and merciful divine being who, in other parts of the Bible, exhorts the faithful to love their neighbor as themselves. How can the same God who teaches the importance of love, compassion, and forgiveness also command such brutal massacres? This tension between different portrayals of God raises the hypothesis that these passages, rather than reflecting God's true will, may have been influenced by the cultural and political factors of the time when they were written. The Bible was composed over many centuries, and each part of it reflects a specific historical context. Some of these violent narratives may have been a response to the conditions of war and conflict that prevailed in the ancient Middle East. In an environment of constant struggle for survival, violence and war were often seen as necessary to ensure the survival of a people or culture. In this sense, the passages describing the total destruction of enemies may have served to justify or legitimize Israel's military actions, ensuring their own existence amid hostile nations. Another example of controversial narrative appears in the same book of Deuteronomy, where the treatment of women captured in war is described. The passage seems to allow soldiers to take women as wives by force, something that directly conflicts with modern notions of human rights and dignity. These passages challenge us to question whether everything written in the Bible should be interpreted as a literal representation of God's will, or if some parts of the text reflect more the conditions and social norms of the time. Some contemporary theologians suggest that these passages should be read within their cultural and historical context. War was a constant reality in the ancient world, and practices that seem barbaric to us today were common in many cultures. However, this does not completely resolve the moral dilemma that these passages present. For many, the idea that God would have ordered the destruction of entire peoples, including women and children, remains unsettling and difficult to reconcile with the image of a God of love and justice. This tension between the loving God, who calls us to forgive and love, and the warrior God, who commands massacres, challenges us to examine the biblical text more deeply. Perhaps, throughout history, men have attributed actions and orders to God that, in fact, reflected their own needs and political, territorial, or cultural interests. This leads us to reconsider the idea that everything written in the Bible should be interpreted literally as the direct word of God. It is possible that some of these narratives reflect more human will than divine will. The historical context in which the biblical texts were written was full of war, conflict, and violence, and it is likely that some passages were shaped by these realities. In this sense, these parts of the Bible may be better understood as expressions of the human understanding of the time, rather than a direct revelation of God's will. The idea that the Bible may have been altered or shaped by humans over time is uncomfortable for many believers, but it is important to recognize that the process of forming the biblical texts was long and complex. This does not diminish the importance of the Bible as a sacred text, but it reminds us that its composition involved a series of human factors, including theological, political, and cultural choices. A clear example of this process of human influence over the composition of the Bible can be seen in the Council of Nicaea, held in the 4th century AD. During this council, led by the Roman Emperor Constantine, several theological issues were debated, and certain works were selected to compose what we now know as the New Testament. Texts that were widely read and respected by some Christian communities were left out, while others were considered inspired and included in the canon. This suggests that from the very beginning, decisions about which texts would be considered sacred were influenced by theological and political debates. This type of human intervention was not limited to the New Testament. The texts of the Old Testament also went through processes of editing and adaptation over the centuries. There is evidence that different versions of certain books circulated among Jewish communities, and that some texts were adjusted to better align with the religious and social needs of the time. This leads us to reflect on the extent to which the texts we have today are faithful representations of the originals, and to what extent they were modified to meet specific objectives. In addition to theological edits and choices, the very transmission of biblical texts over time was susceptible to errors and distortions. Before the invention of the printing press, the Bible was copied by hand by scribes, and while many of these scribes were extremely dedicated to their work, the manual nature of this process inevitably resulted in mistakes. Some words were altered, phrases were reversed, and in some cases, additions were made to clarify or emphasize certain theological points. These small errors, when accumulated over centuries, may have introduced distortions into the original text. These human interventions can also be seen in how the Bible has been interpreted over the centuries. Often, official church interpretations were used to justify practices or beliefs that we now consider morally questionable, such as slavery or the oppression of women. This reminds us that, in addition to the texts themselves, the way they are interpreted and applied can also be shaped by human interests. However, these questions about human intervention in the formation and transmission of the Bible do not mean we should discredit the sacred text. On the contrary, they invite us to read the scriptures with discernment and humility, recognizing the complexity of the process by which the texts have been transmitted to us. The Bible is a multifaceted text, containing many layers of meaning, and by recognizing the human influences that shape the text, we can approach it with an open mind and a heart willing to hear the true divine message. The question that remains is, how can we discern what is truly divine in the biblical text, and what may be the result of human intervention? This is a question that theologians, scholars, and believers have asked for centuries, and the answer may not be simple. Careful study of the original texts, knowledge of the historical context in which they were written, and a critical and spiritual approach are essential to interpreting the text fairly and thoughtfully. One example of how the biblical text may have been misinterpreted over the centuries is the use of the Bible to justify slavery. In the New Testament, there are passages that, at first glance, seem to support the practice of slavery, which is difficult to accept when considering the message of Jesus, who is often described as the defender of the oppressed and marginalized. How, then, can we reconcile these passages with Jesus' teachings of love and compassion? A problematic example appears in Paul's letters, where he instructs slaves to obey their masters. It is important to remember that at the time Paul wrote these letters, slavery was a common practice in the Roman Empire, and many early Christians were themselves slaves. Paul's instruction may have been an attempt to ensure that Christians lived in peace with the laws and customs of the time, avoiding conflicts with Roman authorities. However, this does not mean that he or Jesus supported slavery as an institution. Many scholars argue that Paul's words were misinterpreted or misapplied over the centuries. Rather than approving slavery, Paul may have been trying to teach Christians to live according to Jesus' principles, even in situations of oppression. He emphasizes, for example, that in Christ, there is neither slave nor free, but that all are equal in the eyes of God. This message of spiritual equality was, however, distorted throughout history to justify oppression. The idea that Jesus would have approved of slavery is difficult to reconcile with the essence of his message. Jesus preached the liberation of captives, the healing of the sick, and freedom for the oppressed. He challenged the social and religious norms of his time, constantly showing compassion and mercy to the marginalized. When we look at his life and teachings, it is hard to imagine that he would have supported a dehumanizing practice like slavery. The history of slavery within the Christian tradition serves as a reminder of how sacred texts can be used to justify injustices. For centuries, the Bible was used both to support slavery and to combat it. Abolitionists, for example, used the scriptures to argue against the oppression and dehumanization of slaves, while defenders of slavery relied on specific passages to maintain the status quo. Today, we can look at these passages with a new perspective, recognizing the mistakes of the past and seeking an interpretation more faithful to Jesus' message. This invites us to reflect on how we use sacred texts in our lives today. Are we using them to justify our own agendas, or are we truly listening to Jesus' call to love, liberate, and care for the most vulnerable. The return of Jesus, or the second coming, is one of the central promises of Christianity, and its interpretation varies between different traditions and theologies. Many Christians believe that Christ's return will be a physical and apocalyptic event in which Jesus will return to earth to judge humanity. However, there is another interpretation that suggests the return of Christ should not be understood solely as a physical event, but as a spiritual awakening within each of us. This more spiritual interpretation of Christ's return invites us to live Jesus' teachings in a practical and immediate way. Instead of passively waiting for a future event, it calls us to be agents of transformation in the world, bringing Christ consciousness into our lives and the lives of those around us. Many Christian mystics throughout the centuries have spoken of this idea of spiritual awakening, and for them, the true return of Christ happens when we allow his message and teachings to transform our actions and hearts. The idea that Christ's return could be a spiritual awakening is also connected to the notion that we are all called to be little Christs in the world. This means that we should not only worship Jesus as a distant divine figure, but also follow his example in our own lives. Being Christian, in this sense, is not just a matter of belief, but a daily practice of compassion, love, and forgiveness. This view of Christ's return as a spiritual process of transformation is closely linked to many Christian mystical traditions, such as the Desert Fathers, medieval mystics, and even contemporary strands of Christian spirituality. For these traditions, the true work of a Christian is to become more and more like Christ, not only in words, but in actions and consciousness. This interpretation does not conflict with the traditional belief in the physical return of Christ, but offers a complementary perspective. The spiritual return of Christ, which happens within us, can be seen as a way of fulfilling the promise of redemption and transformation in our lives today, without the need to wait for a future event. The history of the name Jesus also illustrates how words and concepts can change over time, influencing our understanding. In Hebrew and Aramaic, the languages spoken by Jesus, his name was Yeshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation. As Christianity spread to the Greek-speaking world, the name was adapted to Isus, due to the phonetic rules of the Greek language. This transformation continued in Latin, where Isus became Jesus, and eventually Jesus in modern languages. This change in the name of Jesus is more than just a matter of linguistics. It reflects how the message of Jesus was transmitted and adapted over the centuries, shaped by the cultures and languages that embraced Christianity. Each change in Jesus' name represents a new phase in the history of Christianity, where faith was reinterpreted to fit new cultural and historical contexts. However, this linguistic evolution also raises questions about how the different names and words we use to speak about Jesus and his message can carry distinct connotations and meanings depending on the context. For the early followers of Yeshua, his name was deeply tied to the promise of God's salvation. For modern Christians, the name Jesus carries a rich tradition of symbolism and faith, shaped by centuries of history. This transformation in names also reminds us that, just as Jesus' name changed, his message was also reinterpreted over the centuries, adapted to the needs and understandings of different eras and places. This does not diminish the importance of his message, but it invites us to reflect on how the Christian tradition is a living tradition, constantly evolving and dialoguing with the world around it. The connection between the Bible and the ancient civilizations of the Near East, such as Sumer and Egypt, is also a fascinating point of study. The rich tapestry of myths and legends from these civilizations often shares impressive parallels with biblical stories, suggesting a possible influence of these ancient traditions on Judeo-Christian texts. Sumerian mythology, in particular, offers several examples of narratives that resemble biblical stories. The Sumerians, who lived in Mesopotamia, believed in a pantheon of powerful gods, each responsible for different aspects of creation and life. Among these deities was Enlil, a figure associated with the sky and wind, who ruled over order in the world. Enlil, like Yahweh in the Bible, was also responsible for a great flood that destroyed humanity, except for a chosen man who built an ark and saved his family and the animals. This story, recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, has notable similarities with the biblical account of Noah's flood. Both accounts speak of a great flood sent by the gods to punish humanity for its corrupt behavior, and both describe the construction of an ark to save living beings from destruction. However, while in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian gods are portrayed as capricious and fallible, The biblical flood is described as an expression of divine justice, and Noah's salvation is attributed to his moral righteousness. These parallels show how ancient cultures shared common themes in their religious narratives, adapting these themes to reflect their own beliefs and values. In the case of the Bible, the flood story was re-signified within a monotheistic perspective, where Yahweh, the one true God, is the creator and judge of all humanity. Another example of Sumerian influence on the biblical tradition is the figure of the Anunnaki, powerful gods who, according to Sumerian texts, descended to Earth to rule and influence humanity. Some speculative theories suggest that the Anunnaki were not just mythological gods, but could have been extraterrestrial beings who interacted with humanity in ancient times, influencing the development of civilization. These theories, popularized by authors like Zecharia Sitchin, are controversial and widely rejected by mainstream scholars, but they continue to fascinate many readers who seek answers to the mysteries of ancient history. According to these theories, the Anunnaki would have used genetic engineering to create the first human beings, mixing their own DNA with that of primitive species that inhabited the Earth. While highly speculative, this idea touches on deep questions about the origin of humanity and our place in the cosmos. Regardless of whether we believe in these theories or not, Sumerian myths and their connections to biblical stories remind us that the Bible did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. It is part of a rich tradition of narratives that attempt to understand the relationship between the divine and the human. By studying these ancient myths, we can gain a deeper understanding of how biblical stories were influenced by other traditions, and how they, in turn, shaped the worldview of the civilizations that followed them. Finally, the history of monotheism, a central idea in Judaism and Christianity, may also have roots in earlier religious experiences, such as the cult of the solar god Aton, promoted by the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt in the 14th century BC, attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by promoting the exclusive worship of Aton, to the detriment of traditional Egyptian polytheism. Although the cult of Aton was short-lived and reversed after Akhenaten's death, his experiment with monotheism may have left a lasting mark on the religious history of humanity. Some scholars suggest that Akhenaten's monotheistic ideas may have influenced the development of Hebrew monotheism, although there is no direct evidence of this connection. However, both Akhenaten and Moses, central figures in the history of monotheism, lived in Egypt during periods of great religious transformation, and it is possible that Akhenaten's ideas circulated among the religious and political elites of the time. This interconnection between Egyptian religion and biblical traditions can also be seen in artifacts such as the Ark of the Covenant, which some scholars suggest has its origins in Egypt. The Ark, described as a sacred chest containing the tablets of the Ten Commandments, was central to the faith and identity of the people of Israel. However, some theories suggest that the Ark could have originally been an Egyptian cult object, brought out of Egypt during Moses' exodus and adapted to fit Israelite religious traditions. Regardless of the truth of these theories, the Ark of the Covenant remains one of the most enigmatic artifacts in biblical history. Its description in the scriptures suggests that it was more than just a symbolic object. It was carried into battles, and its presence seemed to guarantee the Israelites' victory. However, there was also great fear surrounding the Ark, and only the priests were allowed to approach it, under the penalty of death, for those who violated its rules. This fear surrounding the Ark may be related to the idea that it contained not only the tablets of the law, but also the power of Yahweh. The Ark represented the physical presence of God among his people, and any violation of its sanctity was seen as a direct affront to God. This view reinforces the importance of the Ark as a symbol of both power and fear, reflecting Yahweh's central role in the life of the people of Israel. Ultimately, the Bible is a multifaceted text, influenced by a wide range of cultural and religious traditions. By studying its connections with other ancient mythologies, we can gain a richer and deeper understanding of its narratives and meanings. Recognizing these influences and parallels does not diminish the importance of the scriptures, but it offers us a new perspective on the history of religion and the role of the Bible in shaping humanity's spiritual traditions.